The new Venom movie won't be hitting theaters until October of 2020, but in the meantime, there have been some major developments in the comic books that could have a huge impact on how the sequel turns out. While the movie plot is still shrouded in secrecy, we can't help but wonder if they will try to include one of the biggest, baddest villains to ever exist in Marvel history. While we still have almost an entire year to wait before getting to feast our eyes on the second Venom movie, that doesn't mean we can't speculate wildly over what it will be about in the meantime. And with a story that is too juicy to be ignored that has been developing over in the Marvel Comics for the last couple of years, we can't help but wonder if we will catch a glimpse of the newly crowned greatest villain in the Marvel Universe in the Venom sequel. In case you don't keep up with the comic books yourself, the villain we are talking about is Knull, the first ever symbiote, and great-great-granddaddy to all other symbiote life forms out there slithering around in the universe. Symbiotes such as Venom and Carnage. Over the last few years, the mythology of Venom and Carnage has been rewritten and expanded to reveal the existence of Knull and explain why he might be the most powerful villain in the universe. While we couldn't possibly cram all of the details of Knull's existence into one video, we will do our best to give you all of the relevant history that we need to in order to tie into the upcoming Venom. See, Knull is an ancient being and one of the elder gods, born out of darkness and the first thing to ever emerge at the beginning of the universe. Because of this, he is considered the god of symbiotes. In his early days before the creation of, well, anything, Knull actually molded the living abyss around him into the first symbiote, a weapon called All Black the Necrosword. Is All Black the Necrosword a great name for a baby? We think so. Should we change our name to that? That's Mr. All Black the Necrosword to you. Yep. It works. So, once Knull had created our new namesake weapon of the Abyss, he set about attempting to conquer the universe with it, as one does. After a long time of campaigning against the creation of light in the universe, Knull realized it would be helpful to create something of an entourage. So like Adrian Grenier did in 2004, he birthed a ton of other symbiotes and unleashed them into the universe just like at the end of Charlotte's Web. Sorry, one more side note. Does anyone else find the birth of 1,000 spiders the least heartwarming ending to a movie possibly of all time? You made some nice webs, Charlotte, but the mass hatching of all your disgusting babies is actually a nightmare. Okay, no more interruptions. After a long while, Knull was finally able to be conquered, for a little while, by Silver Surfer, who briefly banished him in order to allow the rest of the universe to develop for a few million millennia, which we greatly appreciate. Thank you, Silver Surfer. In the comic series Absolute Carnage, Knull was woken up on Earth, where he found himself in a squabble with one of his distant children, Venom. Surprisingly, Venom was actually able to defeat almost all of Knull, leaving just one tiny piece of the God of Symbiotes behind. But as we all know, when it comes to symbiotes, a little goes a long way. As you might expect, by this point, the mythology of Knull had amassed a bit of a cult following. As in a literal cult, who believed that he would make his glorious return and set the universe back to the endless darkness from whence it came. It is this cult that is responsible for taking that little bit of leftover Knull and inserting it into the body of Carnage. That's right, the Carnage, aka the symbiote being hosted by demented psychopath Cletus Cassidy. But while they thought that Knull would take over Carnage's body and be reborn, Knull and Carnage wound up in a vicious internal screaming match that resulted in a victory for Carnage. He ended up with more power than he had ever had before, and for the already impressive Carnage, this transformation elevated his abilities to the level of a god. After all of this, the cult tells Carnage some interesting information that they have learned. They tell him that every time a symbiote comes into contact with someone, it leaves a small trace behind. But, and here's the important bit, if the original symbiote is to eat those it has come into contact with, it will return that little trace back to its rightful owner, making it more and more powerful. Armed with this new information, Carnage sets out on a mission to go back and snack on everyone he has ever come into contact with. which also means everyone that Venom has also come into contact with. Because, as you may remember, Carnage was born when Cletus and Eddie Brock briefly shared a prison cell together. When Eddie escaped, Venom left a little baby symbiote behind, which attached itself to the already psychotic Cletus, and the two got on like a house on fire. Enough history for you? And that's just one comic series. All over Marvel, different stories are taking place that all have to do with the insanely powerful Knull. So now that we're all on the same page, what exactly does this mean for Venom 2? Well, we know that Carnage is going to be a major part of Venom 2 because of that amazing mid-credits scene from the first movie. In it, we see that Eddie Brock has been summoned to San Quentin prison to speak to Cletus Cassidy, aka Woody Harrelson, in a spectacular Little Orphan Annie wig. At the end of the clip, Cassidy explicitly states that he will escape, and when he does, and this is a quote, "There's gonna be carnage." Fans everywhere understood right away that one of the most epic comic book villains ever would be making his big screen debut in the Venom sequel, and couldn't be more ready to see that happen. While there is a possibility that they will just give us the Carnage origin story, all of this new lore from Marvel seems just too juicy to ignore. Besides, the fact that they have just made this big announcement about Knull being the most powerful Marvel villain out there, it seems too perfectly timed to be random. Thing is, ever since the end of Marvel's Phase 3 and the destruction of Thanos, audiences everywhere are wondering where we go from here. Since Thanos was lauded as the most powerful being in the universe, how will the studios ever top what they did with Avengers Endgame? Chances are the studios are going to be looking for a new big bad to bring in and unite everyone against in an epic battle, and Knull seems like he might just be the guy. And yet, what iteration of the Knull story could it be? We've laid out the Absolute Carnage storyline for you here, and it could definitely be a possible contender for the next big fight. After all, once Carnage sets out on his mission to munch on anyone that Venom has ever come in contact with, that includes a ton of familiar faces to the MCU, and specifically Spider-Man. Not only that, but the destruction he is about to wreak is definitely big enough to extend beyond just Eddie Brock, and we could definitely see some other heroes having to get involved in order to defeat him. There's a whole thing about infecting humans with brain worms to turn them into mindless soldiers that we haven't even mentioned here because, well, it's pretty gross. But it would make for a great and terrifying enemy. And yet, there is a whole other Knull story that might just bind together a couple different Sony and Marvel movie worlds in a way that would be absolutely epic to see on screen. After spending many years with All Black the Necrosword by his side, it was eventually stolen by a fella known as Gore, the God Butcher. We say stolen, but really it bonded with Gore in the way that a symbiote does after Knull was incapacitated in battle. After enough time going around slaying gods together, and a ton of other stuff that happened that we can't get into if we all want to eventually get on with our lives, All Black finds its way into the hands of a very familiar face. All Black quickly bonds with Loki, who decides it's time for a rebrand and demands to be referred to as Loki the Necro God, or Loki the All Butcher. Catchy. This could absolutely be one way that the Venom movies eventually bring in the rest of the MCU and Sony characters. Because let's be honest, as much as they are trying to keep the franchises separate, one way or another they will find a way to cross over. With the new deal that has Kevin Feige producing the next Spider-Man movie, effectively allowing Spidey to stay in the MCU, the future of Sony and Marvel characters being able to jump from studio to studio seems bright. Since Spider-Man and Venom are so closely tied together, it's really only a matter of time before the two meet on screen. And maybe, just maybe, they'll find themselves working together to stop some form of Knull from wiping out the universe. The thing is, this revelation about Knull's power is still relatively new, so we might not get an appearance in this Venom sequel. Chances are, since the script has already been penned, the story will focus more on the creation of Carnage and feature an initial conflict between him and Venom. Audiences who aren't familiar with the comics will need to be introduced to just how powerful Carnage is, and how much of a terrifying threat he is to Venom and, well, everyone around him. For starters, Carnage is physically stronger than Venom, and a whole lot crazier too. The symbiote here is bonded with the body and brain of a completely demented, violent, and nihilistic psychopath after all. Along with that, Carnage can actually reshape bits of his body into weapons that can be used as shrapnel. And then there's the not so insignificant detail that Carnage has the ability to alter people's minds and memories if he can get close enough to get at their brains. We also know that Venom 2 has plans to introduce Shriek, the longtime accomplice and sometimes romantic partner of Carnage. Also known as Francis Barrison, Shriek is a drug dealer whose latent mutant abilities come to the surface after a lot of trauma. These abilities include sonic blast, flight, and the power to dredge up dark emotions and pain in her victims. The combination of Carnage and Shriek is absolutely lethal, and one that will definitely be a part of this upcoming Venom sequel. While we might not get the epic introduction of the universe-destroying elder god Knull and his super cool living sword by next October, we do know that Tom Hardy is signed on to a 3-picture Venom deal. So this movie won't be the last. And with all of this incredibly interesting new Venom and Carnage backstory to dive into, plus the need for a newer, bigger Superbat to bring together a whole new group of heroes, there is a perfect Knull-shaped hole in the MCU just waiting to be filled. Sure, we have no idea what Marvel and Sony have planned for the future, but if they do decide to get into it with Knull, we'll be lining up at the box office to see how it all unfolds. All of these details about Knull are enough to make us wonder why we thought Thanos was such a big deal in the first place. What about you? Are you a comics fan who saw all of this coming from miles away? Or is this all just as new and exciting for you as it was for us? What do you hope to see in Venom 2? Let us know down below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of the latest videos from CBR.